On January 13, 2012, CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer ran a story by senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen called Pimping for Ron Paul.
Some prostitutes in Nevada are enthusiastically backing Ron Paul for president. CNN's senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen shows us why.
Good to see everybody.
Ron Paul's met a lot of his supporters, but he probably hasn't met these women, and they love him.
If a client comes into the Bunny Ranch and says, I'm pimping for Paul, they're going to have a real good time. Aren't they, girls?
Yes!
Now, the only thing more insulting than CNN's attempt to pass this smear job off as journalism is the fact that they try to pass it off as medical journalism by briefly discussing the health regulations of the Nevada brothel industry.
Paul supports their right to make their living this way.
Yes, you have a right to do things that are very controversial.
They were implying that Dr. Paul personally endorses prostitution, which he doesn't. He simply supports the state's rights to choose. But we'll come back to that.
First, they have the right to reject any customer they don't like. So you bring a gentleman in here, and you do an inspection of some kind? What are you looking for?
We ask him to drop his pants.
They're looking for signs of sexually transmitted diseases.
Now we've entered what would be considered the medical section of the report, where Mrs. Cohen spends roughly a minute talking about how women have the right to inspect and reject customers, how every customer has to use a condom by law, how girls must be frequently tested for STDs, and how Harry Reid has threatened to shut down prostitution in Nevada, which is why prostitutes support and are raising money for Ron Paul.
The owner of the Bunny Ranch tells us that he tried to donate that money directly to the campaign, but folks at the campaign told him, no, we don't want it directly. Please give it to a PAC that supports Ron Paul instead. We reached out to the Ron Paul campaign, Wolf, and we did not get a response. Wolf?
Elizabeth Cohen, thank you.
So why didn't the Paul campaign respond to Mrs. Cohen and this award-winning piece of medical journalism? Because they knew it was a hit piece. How do they know? Because they were smeared by this very same story 4 years ago. See, this Pimpin' for Paul story has been passed around more media slime balls than Air Force Amy. So where did it come from? How did it start? If you follow the stench all the way back to the source, you'll find that the Pimping for Paul story was actually the product of a collaboration between conservative D-bag and political hack Tucker Carlson and that bastion of journalistic integrity, the New Republic. Back in 2007, Tucker Carlson had a show on MSNBC called Tucker. And during the first half of 2007, Tucker was one of the few media personalities who was receptive to Dr. Paul's message and frequently invited Ron Paul to be a guest on his show. Here's Tucker interviewing Ron Paul just before the first Republican debate in May of 2007.
A nationally televised debate is perhaps the best, maybe the only opportunity for the less famous among the presidential candidates to make their marks with the public. It's a place for those to force their issues with the leading contenders. Well, maybe the most interesting contender in this entire race is a congressman from Texas named Ron Paul. Unlike virtually everyone else in the Republican Party, he is an actual libertarian. He's also run for president before. I'm willing to admit I actually voted for him as a libertarian in 1988. I'll get my conflict out of the way at the very beginning. We welcome now for Simi Valley, California, Ron Paul of Texas. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Well, I slobbered all over you in the intro, so I bet it is. You are Congressman.
Good job.
Thank you. I think you are the only Republican running for president right now who actually voted against the war in Iraq at the very outset. Are you going to bring that up on the stage tonight?
Well, if I have the chance, I certainly will.
But as the months progressed and Dr. Paul's message and popularity began to grow, Tucker's treatment of Dr. Paul became more and more negative. Here's Tucker in August of 2007.
As any faithful viewer of this show knows, we are big fans of Ron Paul, and not embarrassed to say so. He's the libertarian running for the Republican nomination for the White House. Ron Paul is no stranger to sensational headlines, but when you combine the presidential race and strippers, well, that is why they invented cable television. The 2008 campaign has brought together politics and exotic dancing with our most unusual endorsement to date. Michelle Shingal is the author of the blog LibertyLady.com. She is a former stripper. She's also a supporter of the aforementioned Dr. Paul.
Here's the Pimping for Paul story, version 1.0. And it's classic Tucker Carlson. He'll praise you out of one side of his mouth and then bash you out of the other. Here's Tucker on Real Time with Bill Maher in October of 07.
And then Ron Paul gets up, and it's like a Twilight Zone episode. There's one sane man left in the world.
Let me just say about Ron Paul, by the way, everyone loves Ron Paul. It's fashionable to love Ron Paul. I voted for the guy in '88. I'm a true Ron Paul man. If you knew what he really thought, like eliminating the Department of Education, I mean, the liberals who love him would hate him, actually.
There are things about him that I do not agree with.
Well, I do. I agree with him.
No, he's not pro-choice. Is he pro-choice?
No, he's not pro-anything, but he's not pro-war, which is the good thing that...
Can we all stop pretending to love Ron Paul? Because if you really knew, like, following the Constitution means getting rid of all the middle-class subsidies and all the things we take for granted and actually taking responsibility for yourself, and nobody really wants to do that. Can we all stop pretending to love Ron Paul?
This is a telling statement because that's exactly what Tucker Carlson is doing. He's pretending to love Ron Paul because his actions and statements prove the exact opposite. And that brings us to November 5th, 2007, the day the Ron Paul revolution sent a shot across the bow of the establishment.
Presidential candidate Ron Paul raised big bucks and some major eyebrows with a very successful one-day internet fundraising drive. Amazing numbers. The impressive numbers, in fact, attracting new attention to a candidate many had simply assumed was an extreme long shot. Carol Costellos here in the Situation Room.
Meet Ron Paul, winner of the biggest money bomb of this year's Republican presidential campaign. That's what his supporters call it, his money bomb. It means his supporters dropped $4,380,000 in 24 hours, despite a decided lack of traditional media coverage. Ron Paul did participate in all of the Republican debates, but after they ended, TV anchors ignore him. According to the tracking company VMS, Ron Paul's name was mentioned just 4,695 times on TV news and cable shows from August of 2006 to August of 2007. What a comparison? John McCain was mentioned 95,005 times.
The November 5th money bomb signified a sea change in American presidential politics. The traditional model of campaigning, fundraising, and grassroots organization that had relied so heavily on the support of the mainstream media was being challenged by the internet. Simply ignoring Ron Paul was no longer an option, and portraying him as the harmless gadfly or the kooky grandpa was obviously not working. New narratives would be needed to define Ron Paul and his supporters and explain his growing support to the rest of America. Ron Paul was now officially a threat to the establishment, and the gloves were coming off. In the weeks that followed, the New Republic commissioned Tucker Carlson to write a piece on the Paul campaign. Tucker's article, entitled Pimp My Ride, On the Road with Ron Paul's Merry Band of Misfits and His Hooker Fan Club, was published on the New Republic website on December 31st, 2007, just days before the Iowa caucuses, and subsequently parroted throughout the mainstream media in the weeks that followed. A condescending collection of ridicule and praise, the story was anything but flattering to Dr. Paul. But the real damage had already been done by Tucker himself while embedded as a journalist with the Paul campaign. On Monday, November 19, 2007, Dr. Paul spoke at a rally held in Las Vegas on the UNLV campus. Tucker arrived late, missing the speech, and began interviewing several Paul supporters in the lobby. He then joined the campaign as they traveled to the next event in Pahrump, Nevada, had dinner with Dr. Paul, and conducted his interview. After dinner, Tucker called his self-described good friend, Dennis Hoff, owner of the world-famous Moonlight Bunny Ranch brothel, and invited him to attend a Ron Paul event in Reno on Tuesday. The next day, Tucker hopped in a limo with a pimp and 2 prostitutes and used his press credentials to get them backstage at the event. After the speech, Tucker tried to get Dr. Paul to take a picture with Air Force Amy, and after being denied the photo op, proceeded to march the entire group up on the stage to have their photos taken in front of the Ron Paul banner. And that's all it took.
These working girls have decided to raise support for GOP press candidate Ron Paul.
This is the room that I'll actually be prostituting for Paul.
That was CBS. Here's ABC.
I'll show you where I pimp for Paul.
She says she asks her clients to contribute to Republican Ron Paul in lieu of giving her a tip.
Very easy to ask for campaign contributions here. It's a lot easier, too, when I take my clothes off.
All the major news networks jumped on the story. And why not? It was a win-win. The media had discovered a new narrative that conveniently painted Paul supporters as pimps and prostitutes. And Dennis Hoff, the shrewd businessman, had discovered that by endorsing Ron Paul, he could get priceless free publicity.
In what way are you going about raising money for this candidate?
Well, we're doing numerous things. One is if you come into the bunny ranch and you say, I'm pimping for Paul, you get 2 bunnies instead of 1. 2 for the price of 1.
Talk about smart marketing. That's a 2-for-1 coupon advertised for free on national news. Can you imagine how many frat boys grabbed their wallets and their Ron Paul t-shirts and headed for the bunny ranch?
Oh, well, hell yeah!
So what did the Paul campaign have to say about this glowing endorsement?
Well, a spokesman for the campaign said that Ron Paul does not condone prostitution, and in fact, if he were a state legislator in Nevada, he'd vote to outlaw it. Well, I spoke to Dennis Hoff about that earlier.
I'm not sure how to take that, although his philosophy is leave it to the states and make it their decision as to whether the business should be legal or not. I think if he said that, first of all, I don't know that Ron Paul said that, and second is that Ron Paul needs to be more educated on our business and find out that the Bunny Ranch is a 52-year-old social experiment that works.
Some of the spin that's out there is that this is a publicity stunt from Tucker Carlson, that Tucker brought you there. You weren't necessarily a Ron Paul fan, that, Tucker was just looking to get publicity for his own show. And how would you respond to that?
Absolutely not. That is absolutely nonsense. It's BS. And it's just not true. Number one, Tucker's not that kind of guy. And number two, I was there. I know what happened. And he called me and said, I just had dinner with Ron Paul. I think you're going to like his views, and I think it's something you should take a look at. And I'm going to invite you to his press conference to go with my guest.
Are you at all afraid that it might bring some unwelcome attention or perhaps be viewed as a negative for people who are out there just beginning to learn about who Ron Paul is?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think that the amount of attention that he's gotten is so small. I mean, who paid attention to this guy? Did you? I mean, I didn't.
Was Dennis Hoff's sudden interest in politics the result of a sincere desire to help Ron Paul and see him elected? Was he really too stupid to realize that his endorsement could only damage Paul and his campaign? Tucker answered that question himself in his Pimp My Ride article, saying Dennis isn't very political, but he's smart. Regardless of what Hoff's true motives were, the real blame lied with the media for orchestrating the event in the first place and for continuing to give the pimp and his prostitutes a national platform to paint Dr. Paul and his supporters in a negative light. The Pimping for Paul story ran its cycle through the end of 2007, only to give way to another article from the New Republic. The Ron Paul newsletter story was published on the day of the New Hampshire primary for maximum effect. The pimp and his prostitutes were no longer necessary and would be sent away until they were needed again. On January 2nd, 2012, the day before the Iowa caucuses, Matt Lewis published a new and improved version of the Pimping for Paul story on the Daily Caller website. Who owns the Daily Caller? Our old friend and true Ron Paul man, Tucker Carlson. Once again, the mainstream media trotted the pimp and his prostitutes out to shock American voters into submission by telling them which candidates were acceptable and which ones were not.
Evangelical leaders held an urgent summit at a Texas ranch this weekend and threw their support behind Rick Santorum as the conservative alternative to Mitt Romney. Meanwhile, the Pimp and Prostitute Coalition has found their favorite among the Republican presidential candidates.
So let's review. An MSNBC anchor on the payroll at the New Republic crashed a Ron Paul press conference with a pimp and 2 prostitutes, launching a devastating smear campaign that has spanned not one but 2 separate presidential campaigns. Or, as some might say, the New Republic paid Tucker Carlson to screw Ron Paul, which would actually make this a photo of a pimp and 3 prostitutes. Oh, and one more thing. CNN actually gets style points for the most creative attempt at putting lipstick on this pig the second time around by dressing it up as a medical report. Not content to settle for the same old, tired version of the Pimping for Paul story that they ran 4 years ago, and going that extra mile for some shred of credibility, Wolf and his crew proved that they really are the best political pundits that money can buy.